Hello, everyone. This is Aurus Sanchez or Miel Shimon here in New York City, Brooklyn, with another episode of Investigating the Bible. Before we continue, guys, if you haven't, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave your comments or your feedback or your suggestions or even questions down below. I would really, really appreciate it. Now, let us go on with the presentation. Today's a very interesting one that people have wanted me to speak about. It's a little controversial, but let's go over it. So, the question is Jesus or was Jesus a direct descendant of King David, unraveling Matthew's genealogy? Ooh, I even got a very interesting picture here of David cutting off Goliath's head, as you can see here in the art. Now, why, first of all, before I even get into this, why is this such a controversial question? Because one of the basic requirements of the Messiah, of the Mashiach ben David, that Christianity and Jews are waiting for, right? The Messiah, right? Now, of course, Christians see that the Messiah, the Mashiach ben David, is and was Jesus. In Judaism, Jesus is not seen as the Messiah, not even as a prophet, right? Of course, in Judaism, we acknowledge that he existed, he was Jewish and so forth, but he is not part of the Hebrew scriptures. He's not part of the theology at all. And I've done different videos explaining why. So if you haven't, check those videos out. Now, and I'm just making this very basic for now, from a theological and historical perspective. Now, the reason why this is so important is because one of the basic requirements is that the Messiah has to come from the direct lineage of King David and King Solomon. King David had many children, right? And one of them is the famous King Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon. The Messiah must come from King David and King Solomon. From that lineage, the Messiah must come from, right? Now, the thing is that in Christianity, they are saying, based off the Gospels and many other pieces of evidence that they can bring up from the New Testament, they say that Jesus is a direct descendant from King David. Directly, right? And the big proofs that they come up with are the two genealogies, the famous birth genealogies that come up in the Gospels, in the Gospel of Luke and Matthew, right? And the other Gospels of Mark and John, and even in the epistles of Paul and on the other letters in the New Testament, there is no genealogies. There's nothing mentioning that Jesus comes from a virgin mother or he's coming from the line of David. Now, and according to these two genealogies, this is like proof to show Jesus comes from all these people, these kings, and look, this is why when he came on earth, he's the Messiah, right? So this is just one of the basic ones. Now, according to Judaism, right, Jesus does not come from this lineage, right? But other than that, there's so much proof in the New Testament that shows us, from an objective standpoint, that Jesus could not have been the Messiah. He could not have been, right? At all. But something, let's go into more details about this question. And let's specifically unravel, we're also going to go into Luke's genealogy in this video, but we're going to unravel Matthew's genealogy. Matthew is like one of the favorite books of the New Testament, right? There's so many famous things that happen in that book of Matthew. We have the Sermon on the Mount. We have the Transfiguration more in detail. It also comes out in Mark, but it's a lot more famous there too. A lot of Jesus' sayings, the Beatitudes, so much things happen here in the Gospel of Matthew. But let's go into detail now. So, is Jesus a direct descendant of King David, unraveling Matthew's genealogy? So let's continue. So now, before we start, these are some of my sources that I will be mentioning. Again, I'm using a lot more sources, but I didn't have enough space, so here's just some of the sources I'll be using, some of the books and chapters and verses that I'll be going through. Let's go through the agenda. We're going to go over 4 questions. What is the difference between Matthew's and Luke's genealogy? I kind of mentioned that these are the only 2 places where you'll find, Jesus' genealogy, supposedly. There's nothing else in the New Testament that shows this. The second question is, what are the problems with Matthew's genealogy, which we're going to go over that during this video. The third question: what was the curse of Jeconiah, and what does it have to do with Jesus? What is this? What's this curse of Jeconiah? Don't worry about it. I got you. I'm going to get you later on. I'll explain this later on in the video. And last but not least, what are some Christian answers in regards to Jesus' cursed lineage? So there's a lot happening here. I don't know if you realize. So not only are we going to explain the difference between the two genealogies that show that Jesus is, he comes from the line of David. We're going to go over those two. What are the problems that are historically, or what are the two errors that these two genealogies have? What are some Christian answers in regards to explaining or trying to defend Jesus' genealogy? And we're going to go over Matthew's cursed lineage, the curse of Jeconiah. What is it? What does Jesus have to do with it? So this is going to be very interesting. All right, let's go to questions 1 and 2. So the first question is, what is the difference between Matthew and Luke's genealogy? So let's go over that first. And I put here a little picture, just some interesting things that I think as you guys are watching should have in mind. That Matthew places a great emphasis on Jesus as the king. Matthew's genealogy starts with Abraham Avinu, and goes all the way forward. And Matthew's genealogy is divided into 3 groups of 14, right? And then at the end of that genealogy, it's showing that, in these 3 groups of 14, it goes to Joseph, which is supposedly the adopted father of Jesus, and then we get into Jesus, right? Now, I'm going to explain all this. Now, first of all, I want to mention is that, at first glance, when you look at the genealogy of Luke versus Matthew, or Matthew versus Luke, you'll realize something. Luke's genealogy is much longer than Matthew's. If both of them are showing the genealogy of Jesus, right, shouldn't they both be the same? It's not that it's not like Jesus is having, new family members emerge and, one genealogy is going to be longer or one is going to be shorter. They should have the exact amount, the same people as well. But Luke's is much longer. Now, what's the reason for this? Luke, right now, the explanations that I'm going to be giving now are different ways that I've heard different types of Christians from different types of Christian denominations explain, the genealogy, the different genealogies in Luke and Jesus. So Luke supposedly traces Jesus' genealogy. Well, according to the text, he traces Jesus' genealogy all the way back to Adam, while Matthew stops at Abraham. In both genealogies, the line from Abraham to David, right, is roughly the same. But once we go from David on, this is where the two genealogies in these 2 books that are in the New Testament start to diverge. They start to go into different ways. Matthew traces Jesus' genealogy through David's son, Shlomo HaMelech, Solomon the king. While if we look at Luke, after David, Luke starts to trace the line through David's other son, which is Nathan. Also, I think it's interesting to notice that Joseph has a different father in each account, and Matthew and Luke's genealogy. So each father has a different name. Joseph's father and Matthew's is Jacob, and Luke is Haley. Now, the question is how can we reconcile these differences, right? How do they do it? How does Christianity fix these problems? And I've realized that it comes to only three types of different explanations. And even then, these 3 explanations are reaching. They're reaching so much to try to explain away these differences. So let's go over. I'm not going to go through all of them into so much detail, but I'm just going to give you guys a basic overview. So the first explanation I've heard, right, about these differences or how to reconcile Matthew's and Luke's genealogy is the Joseph versus Mary theory, right? Which is that they try to suggest that Matthew, the book of Matthew, traces Joseph's genealogy, right? Which is true, while Luke traces Mary's genealogy. Now, why do they say this? Which, by the way, Luke is not tracing Mary's genealogy. That's not what's happening here. right? That at all. There's nowhere in the text in Luke, right, that says, oh, and by the way, this is Mary's genealogy. If you even look at the bottom of Luke's genealogy to where we're trying to get to, it's gonna mention Joseph. It's not going to mention Mary at all. So the reason some take this approach that I just mentioned is because Matthew, if you study or you read the book of Matthew, he's focusing his attention on Joseph and the birth narratives, while Luke focuses more on Mary. Now, why? Is because the book of Luke is very pro-woman. There's a lot of woman characters in the book of Luke. So in Luke, if you realize, whoever wrote Luke, which by the way, whoever wrote Luke also wrote the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles. So he describes, the conversation that the Malach angel, Gabriel, has with Mary. We also see Mary's visit to her cousin Elizabeth. Again, there's so many examples showing that Luke is pro-woman. Moreover, even though Luke doesn't mention Mary in the genealogies I mentioned earlier, it's actually Joseph's line. If you look up Luke chapter 1, verse 27, we clearly see this. We even know that Mary most likely comes from the orbit of the family of Levi, right? How do we know this? Luke chapter 1, verse 5. Moreover, if we look in Luke chapter 2, verse 4, right, the author insists that it was necessary for Mary to move with Joseph, right, to move out of where they were from, to go from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Why? Because he was from the house of David. It says it because if we look at Luke, it mentions that there was this world census. There was this world census at the time, and they had to go back to where his ancestors were from. So it mentions that they had to go to where? To Bethlehem, right? Who was born there? King David. The David Hamelech was born there. So Joseph and his family, Mary, his wife, they have to move there because of the world census to his ancestors, to where his ancestors were, right? Why? Because that Joseph was from there. Now, this world census business, this story that Luke is using to try to get Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem, right? That's the technique. That's the literary device. That is the literary technique that's being used in the book of Luke, right? To get this family into Bethlehem so Jesus can be born there, right? Because the Gospels, like Luke and Matthew, they want Jesus to be born in Bethlehem because supposedly, right, according to the Navi Micah chapter 5 verse 2, right? This is the evidence they used to say, yes, the Messiah must be born from Bethlehem. But Micah chapter 5 is not talking about that the Messiah must be born from Bethlehem. It's not. It's a complete misunderstanding of that verse. Completely. And I'll do a video explaining what does Micah chapter 5 really speak about. But it's not a proof to show that the Messiah needs to be born in Bethlehem. Like, that's one of the requirements. None at all. No. The Messiah, the Mashiach ben David, that we're all waiting for, according to the Hebrew scriptures, yes, needs to be Jewish. Needs to be a male Jewish man, right? Whose father's side comes from the line of Judah. Only Judah. Needs to be a Jewish man has to have a Jewish mom with a Jewish father, biological Jewish father that comes from the line of Judah, from the tribe of Judah, which was Jacob's fourth son, because from the promise and the blessing that Jacob, right, one of our forefathers, the third forefather, the third patriarch, in Genesis chapter 49, famous chapter, he gives this blessing, this promise, that the tribe of Judah is going to have this scepter, it's going to have this symbol of kingship, right? That only from this lineage, only from this line, will the kings of Israel come from. That's it, right? So we have to understand that. Again, a lot of the New Testament, to truly understand what's happening in the New Testament, you have to understand the Hebrew scriptures. You have to understand the Torah, the Nevi'im, which is the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings. Not only like a basic understanding, you got to know in depth what are the prophecies, What does this prophet say? What are the major themes? What's happening? Because a lot of times the New Testament takes its material really from two sources, the Hebrew Scriptures and from Greco-Roman material, which I'll do another video explaining this into more detail. So, this is the first way of thinking that Christianity tries to explain away the differences between Matthew and Luke's genealogy. No, Luke is doing Mary's genealogy when it doesn't say that. As a matter of fact, the New Testament never really says from what tribe Mary comes from, but it's most likely from Levi, and there's like very good hints and probability from the beginning of Luke chapter 1, as I mentioned, verse 5. Now let's continue. So this is one way of explaining it. Another theory, another option, another explanation that Christianity uses is the royal versus biological genealogy, that explanation. That what they'll say is that Matthew is tracing Jesus' royal line and is putting an emphasis, a theological emphasis on his messianic claim to the throne, while Luke is tracing Jesus' biological line. So that's why they're so different. So according to this view, Matthew is giving us a lot of clues to suggest that, as I mentioned, it's a theological genealogy. And he's trying to prove that, listen, Jesus does come from King David. Now, why is this? They say that out of all the Gospels, the four Gospels, Matthew is the most Jewish one. It's the most Jewish one. Why? Because if we look at the background, at the historical background of the Gospel of Matthew, whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew is trying, his audience that he's trying to write to, he's trying to convince the Jewish people of that time that, listen, Jesus is and was the Messiah. He really is. Maybe he didn't fulfill the expectation of the Mashiach from the Hebrew Scriptures, but that's fine. He's still the Messiah. He's just fulfilling a different role. But he still is that Messiah, and look at all the proofs. And Matthew's the only gospel that does something called fulfillment citation, does it 11 times, where whoever wrote it tries to bring up 11 types of proofs from different parts of the Hebrew Scriptures to show its Judaism to its Jewish audience, like, listen, according to your own prophets, your own Jewish prophets that come from the Torah or that come from the Hebrew Scriptures from back then, they already predicted this, that Jesus was going to fulfill these things. And look, he did do it. Look at my story. Look what I'm bringing up to you, right? Now, was this gospel successful in recruiting Jews? No, it was not. It was not successful. It was successful, though, in being the early church's favorite gospel, and even today's, the Christianity's favorite gospel, and also recruiting people who were not Jewish at the time, and to bringing them into Judaism. Into bringing them into this back then, into this sect, into this new way of thinking, which back then in the first century, closer to the second century, we see it wasn't even Christianity yet. What has become Christianity today, back then was just a sect of Judaism. It was still Jewish, right? But the thinking was that, listen, we're still going to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're still going to follow the Torah, but the Messiah is Jesus. And this was just a section of Judaism, which slowly started becoming less and less Jewish and became a lot more non-Jewish. And then, the rest is history. So Matthew begins his genealogy by stating the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Christ is the Greek word for Mashiach, for Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. That's Matthew chapter 1:1. So we know, as I mentioned, what was the whole point of Matthew writing this gospel, right? He's trying to convince people that Jesus was the Messiah that comes from the line of David. And this writer is trying to convince, right, the Jews of this message. And he's trying to show how Jewish Jesus was. And this gospel makes Jesus more and more Jewish compared to the other gospels, right? And whoever wrote Matthew is trying to take out the message from 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12 and 16, Isaiah, Jeremiah. He's using all these writings and he's putting them together to show proof. So therefore, from the outset, he's trying to prove to his readers where he's trying to go with his genealogy, right? Also, it's very important that to understand that if you realize in Matthew's genealogy, right, he tries to divide it into 3 sets of 14 genealogies, right? This is what he tries to do. Now, why does Matthew want to divide Jesus, genealogy into 3 sets of 14? Right? That number 14 is extremely important, and he wants that. What he's doing is that the number 14, right? 14 equals to the name David, right? Because in Hebrew, every letter has a number. Like Aleph, which is, the first letter is 1, Beit is 2, Gimel is 3, and so forth, right? So if we take the name David in Hebrew, and you find out which numbers go which, King David equals to the number 14. So again, a lot more theological clues. So this number 14, for whoever wrote Matthew, is very important. He's trying to connect King David directly to Jesus in the text, but also indirectly using numbers and gematria to try to connect it. Or we can also see it this way. He wants the number 14 because what's half of 14? It's 7. In Hebrew, 7 means perfection. It symbolizes perfection, right? So if we have double 7, that's double perfection. Now we got 14. So there's different ways of looking at it that this author, whoever it was, really wanted to prove to this audience, right? Now, but it's important to realize that even though Matthew is doing all these things, or whoever wrote Matthew is writing all these things, this is not evidence to prove that Jesus comes from this line. This is not evidence. This is just what he wrote, and that's it. Now, another indicator that Matthew isn't giving us a biological line, according to what Christianity says, but a royal one, is the breakdown of the genealogy, as I just mentioned, the 3 sets of 14. The 3 sets of 14. Also, he purposely in the beginning puts the name Christ along Jesus, and Christ is not Jesus' last name, as I mentioned, it just means Messiah in Greek. So when Matthew prefaces his genealogy by stating that it's the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, he's trying to give further evidence to his audience, right? Again, these are just reasons that Christians come up with and say, see, this is not his biological lineage. This is just a royal lineage. So I thought that was pretty important. So it's like if Matthew is saying, it's like if Matthew has this giant neon flashing sign that says, Son of David, Son of David, Son of David, directly and indirectly. But Luke doesn't have any of these things. If you look at his genealogy, he doesn't use any of these devices when he's writing his gospel. He just records, supposedly, the biological line of Jesus. Supposedly. He just records the line of Jesus through Mary, even though the lineage is not of Mary, as we've mentioned already. Now, we're going to go to the second question. Give me a second here. The second question is, what are the problems with Matthew's genealogy? So we just spoke about what's the difference between Matthew's and Luke's genealogy, and like so some of the explanations that Christians use. But what are the problems with just Matthew's alone, right? So, for example, if we look at, so the other day I was looking at a Jerusalem Bible. Again, there's so many versions out there of the Bible. I was looking at a Jerusalem Bible, and it read simply, and it said a genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. So this seems to be an allusion, right, or a connection to the opening chapters of Genesis, according to the Greek Septuagint, right? And we can use the example of Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. If we read the beginning of Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, it says, this is the book of the generations of heaven and earth. We can also look at Genesis 5:1 that says, this is the book of the generations of mankind. Now, the question is, could it be that Matthew is just introducing his work as a new Pentateuch, as a new Torah? Right? When I say the word Pentateuch, I'm referring to the first 5 books of the Bible, of the Hebrew Scriptures. So a lot of commentaries have mentioned that they have observed this, that this gospel seems to be arranged around 5 key sermons in the gospel, creating a 5 part work that kind of hints to the Torah, to the Pentateuch, which the author holds in high regard. Then, after presenting this genealogy of Jesus, Matthew explains his strategy that he used to create his genealogy. And as I mentioned, it's those 3 sets of 14. From Abraham to David is 14, supposedly. From David to the exile of Babylon, 14. And from the deportation of Babylon to Jesus, supposedly 14 generations. Now, so this should be understood symbolically. Now, is this supposed to be understood symbolically or historically? Now, it is not historically plausible, right, for a time span of almost 2,000 years to only have 42 generations. Let's think about that. Well, actually, now that I think about it, it's actually 41. I'm sorry, it's 41. Because if you actually look at Matthew's third set, right, his third set of 14 is not really 14 names or 14 generations. It really only has 13 names, right? So even though he writes, it's 3 groups of 14, the last set is actually 13 names if you count it. But theologians over the centuries have treated this genealogy as a factual historical report. And even Christians today, when they look at Matthew's genealogy, they look at it as a factual historical report of Jesus' actual genealogy, right? This is Jesus' real genealogy. They look at it this way, right? But it cannot be. You're telling me that in 2,000 years, there's only been 42 generations? Impossible. No. So that's definitely not factual. It's not a factual historical report, and striven to account for the discrepancies with Luke's genealogy that we mentioned before. So determining also who the real father of Joseph was it Matthew was it Jacob according to Matthew, or was it Heli according to Luke, right? In reality, looking at genealogies as a whole, this is probably the least of our problems if we're trying to understand this literally, which, by the way, the Catholic Church, the Church Christianity looks at this again as a literal genealogy. So what I'm trying to say is that Matthew's genealogy is poorly manipulated and poorly crafted. That's what I'm really trying to say. Because so not only did he make a mistake in saying 3 sets of 14, but in the third set is really 13 names, but he also, whoever wrote Matthew, got rid of several generations and took out several names to create this theological lineage that is no more than 42 generations. In reality, there is 18 names from King Solomon, until Jeconiah, not 14, like what the genealogy of Matthew mentions, right? If you look at the second set of 14 generations in the first chapter of Matthew, you'll see this, right? Now, how do we know that from Solomon to Jeconiah, there's 18 generations and not 14? Is because whoever wrote the book of Matthew took the genealogy that's in the first book of Chronicles, which in the Hebrew Scriptures, chapter 3, verses 5 through 15. If you read that genealogy, read it carefully, then compare that to the genealogy of Matthew chapter 1, right? So, coffee's so good. So, Matthew got rid of a couple names. He got rid of the name Ahaziah, Jehoash, Amaziah, and Jehoiakim, right? Who is the father of Jeconiah, which is this curse of Jeconiah that later on we're going to talk about. So whoever wrote Matthew got rid of these 4 names. And I'm going to say right here, off the bat, and I've said this in other videos, you cannot change the word of God. You can't do that. It's one of the big prohibitions. You cannot do that. You cannot go into Scripture and take away or add things. Where does it say this? Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Torah, chapter 4, verse 2. Or Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 1 as well. You cannot do that, right? And whoever wrote Matthew did this. He's picking and choosing what he wants to fit his own theological agenda, whoever this Greek writer was. Again, we don't know who wrote the Gospels. They're anonymous. Later on, from the 2nd century on, about 100 years after Jesus died, Do we have Papias? And, according to church tradition, he's the guy that supposedly heard it from someone, heard it for someone, that these gospels are attributed to these four names. But there's no actual evidence proving that whoever wrote the gospels, these were the guys who wrote the gospels, right? These were written originally in Greek, not in Hebrew or in Aramaic, which was probably what Jesus spoke. That was his common tongue while he was alive, right? So whoever wrote these gospels, and I'm talking about specifically about Matthew right now, he's picking and choosing what he wants to fit his message, his theological message. Not only does it here in the genealogy, but he does it like 11 other times, right, where he's doing this fulfillment citation, where he's taking prophecies or just verses out of the Hebrew scriptures, and he's saying, look, Jesus fulfilled this. He fulfilled this prediction, or he fulfilled this prophecy. And a lot of the times, they're not even prophecies, but he's taking them out of context. He's taking one verse. And listen, anyone can do that. I can take any verse, from the Bible, from the New Testament, or from the Hebrew scriptures, and I can take it out of context and, put it into a new type of environment and say, listen, this clearly matches what Auru Sanchez predicted yesterday, that this was going to happen the next day, right? So clearly I'm a prophet, or I'm right. No, again, I'm giving you just a very basic example, but this is what he did, whoever wrote this book. And he does this multiple times in his book. And his genealogy is flawed, and he omitted several names, right? So now, why did he do that? And is that correct? No, it's not correct. It's not correct. And again, he did it to fit his own theological agenda, as we mentioned. Now, let us continue. Let us go on, and let's go to the last two questions here. What was the curse of Jeconiah, and what does it have to do with Jesus? And so let's go over that question first. So what is the curse of Jeconiah? Now, before we get into that, the problem. So here's another problem. So not only did we mention that that Matthew's genealogy has discrepancy with Luke's genealogy, the 3 sets of 14, the last set really has 13 names, that whoever wrote Matthew purposely took out several names so he can have 42 generations, even though that's not factually correct. But he wanted 14 generations because he was trying to have that allusion to King David and to perfection to fit it with Jesus. Other than that, another huge issue is this Jeconiah. If you read Matthew chapter 1, there is a portion there where it says that where again, we're mentioning, right, that, Jesus, that Jesus is connected, that in his lineage we have Jeconiah. We're told by Matthew that Jesus comes from Jeconiah, right, who was a wicked king who ruled briefly over the Jewish people, right? Now, Jeconiah was a horrible person. He was really bad. He was so bad that the prophet Jeremiah had publicly cursed this king, declaring that no direct descendant of his would ever reign as a king over the Jewish people and sit on the throne of David. He was terrible. And we'll see this happening where? In Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 30. So, if Jeconiah was the ancestor of Jesus, then he is ineligible to be the Messiah because of the prophetic curse. Let me say that again. Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, this prophet, this Navi, curses in Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 30, this king, and tells him, no direct ancestor of yours will ever sit on the throne of David. So if Jesus is related in his lineage, this guy is in his lineage, it means that he can't be the Messiah. Because the Messiah needs to be a king over Israel. Needs to be a king over the world. And during the Messianic era, not only will he be king over Israel, over the Jewish people, but everyone, the whole world is going to accept him. He's going to be ruling Israel and the world, of course, under God's command. Of course, God is on top of him. So as we can see, this curse cannot be overstated. So no direct descendant of Jeconiah after Jeconiah ever actually, if we look historically and what the biblical and what the Bible tells us, no direct descendant of Jeconiah ever sat on the throne again. And we see this because after Jeconiah, who becomes king of Israel? It's Zedekiah. Zedekiah. Who is Zedekiah? Zedekiah becomes king after Jeconiah, and Zedekiah is Jeconiah's uncle. Is his uncle. So his uncle takes over. So Zedekias, or Zedekiah, takes over as king after Jeconiah. And this works because Zedekiah is a direct descendant of King David, but he's not a direct descendant of Jeconiah. He's Jeconiah's uncle, right? Jeconiah then has a son named Shealtiel, but his son does become king. He doesn't become king. And then we see later on that Zerubbabel, who is a grandson of Jeconiah, becomes the governor, right? Becomes a governor of the Jewish people. Not the king, but the governor of the Jewish people later on, like in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and stuff like that. We'll see this. But he doesn't become a king. So never again do we see that the direct lineage of Jeconiah, do they become king again? We don't see that because it doesn't happen. All right? So I just thought, first of all, I just wanted to mention that. And as I mentioned, Zerubbabel was this amazing and pious leader who becomes a governor but not a king. And Zerubbabel becomes responsible for rebuilding the second temple. So when the Jewish exiles returned, when they finally left, Zerubbabel, they give him a signet ring according to the prophet Haggai, chapter 2, verse 23, right? He becomes the governor, which gives him authority, but not the king. There's a difference. And again, I just gave you a verse so you can see this on your own when you have time. Now, this is what we see in Matthew. Now, Luke, on the other hand, who has the other genealogies, just a tad bit more cautious. Whoever wrote Luke, he removes the name of Jeconiah, right? Because he doesn't want Jesus and Joseph to be associated with this name, Jeconiah. So he puts a different name. He puts the name Neri, and then it says, according to Luke, that Neri was this guy Neri, and then he was the father of Shealtiel. So even though whoever wrote Luke just got rid of the name Jeconiah, he is still speaking about Jeconiah. Because who is the father of Shealtiel? According to 1 Chronicles, it's Jeconiah, right? So he just changed the name so the name Jeconiah doesn't appear, so we can avoid that Jeconiah curse, that prophetic curse that Jeremiah gave to this king Jeconiah. But we still know it's him, and we see this in Luke chapter 3, verse 27. So, now, Matthew, believe it or not, whoever wrote Matthew, also wanted to get rid of the name Jeconiah, but he made a mistake. What was the mistake? So, first of all, I don't know if you know this, but Jeconiah has many names in the Hebrew scriptures, right? Jeconiah is one of them. Coniah is another one, according to Jeremiah chapter 2, or even his Hebrew name, which is Yehoiakim. It's the same person. Now, his father's name, who was also a very bad king, his father's name is what? Yehoiachim. It sounds so similar. So Jeconiah's Hebrew name is Yehoiachim, but his father's name is Yehoiakim. So there's a chin and there's a kim. There's a difference. I don't know if we see it. Again, it is so slight. So it sounds almost identical. So whoever wrote Matthew confused both names and removed his father's name instead. Right? Now, this is not typical that whoever wrote Matthew made a mistake like this. Right? Just to give you one more example, he made another mistake. He makes another mistake later on in the book of Matthew, where the famous story of Jesus, triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Matthew is the only one out of all the Gospels who has a story. He writes that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on 2 donkeys, or on 2 animals. Mark and Luke, he only has, they only have Jesus riding on 1 animal. But Matthew has Jesus riding on 2 animals because he made a mistake, because he misread and misunderstood the the literary technique that was used in Zechariah chapter 9:9, which is this synonymous parallelism, which I mentioned in a different video. But if you want to know more about that technique, write your comment down below and I can speak more about it. But he made that mistake as well. So it's not typical of whoever wrote this book to make mistakes. Now, so we see that this prophetic curse in Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 30 is there. Now, we're going to go into a little bit more in detail about that curse, but what is Jeremiah 22 about? Like, what's the context? I always like to say, read the whole chapter in context so you can have a better understanding, like what's happening. So I'm just going to give you guys the overview, but go to your Bibles, and read like what's happening in Jeremiah 22. But first of all, it just begins with a dire prophecy, a very urgent prophecy to the king Zedekiah first, right? First, the king Zedekiah in chapter 22, which, by the way, this message that this prophet's about to say in this chapter was already mentioned in chapter 21. But now God tells Jeremiah to go speak to him personally to deliver this message. And this big message is in verse from 3 to 5 in chapter 22 of Jeremiah. And he basically, this prophet tells this king, right, that you need to make sure that in your kingdom there's justice and righteousness. You must give righteousness. You must, be a tzaddik. There must be mishpat. There has to be justice and righteousness throughout the kingdom, right? You shouldn't cheat people. People should treat the widow and the poor people correctly. And this is one of the hugest themes in the prophets, right? The prophets, the whole point of the prophets is to highlight the issues, the problems, the mistakes that the Jewish people did. Why? So that future generations, we as a humanity, as the Jewish people or even non-Jewish people who are reading this, we can learn from their mistakes and we can avoid it and do better and bring peace and bring harmony to humankind. That's why all these mistakes and all these problems are written out throughout the prophets. And the prophet is saying, listen, you need to be a better example, and your kingdom, the people need to stop cheating people. We need to treat everyone fairly, the widow, the poor. There must be righteousness, justice, right? Now, it's referring to them specifically, but also to have a decent, appropriate society, as I just mentioned. Now, in these verses, the prophet Jeremiah is giving the king Zedekiah a choice. He's giving him a choice. If you listen to me, then you get to keep and preserve the glory and the prestige of this Davidic dynasty. But if not, it's going to crumble. And spoiler alert, if you don't know, it does crumble. If you even continue to read, if you read what happens to this king is horrible. This king later on becomes exiled. The king of Babylon, right, Nebuchadnezzar, kills King Zedekiah's children in front of him, and then they blind him forever. And then he stays like that. What a horrible, tragic ending, right? So as you can tell from this ending, the Davidic dynasty, there's a pause in it. There's a stop to it after King Zedekiah. Now, in chapter 22, from verse 10 and on, now we start to speak about Jeconiah's father, who was who? Jehoiakim. And we said that Matthew, or whoever wrote Matthew, took out his name out of his lineage, right? By mistake, he did it. He made a mistake. He was really trying to get rid of Jeconiah's name, but he instead took off his father's name by accident. And we see that Jeconiah's father, he was rebellious, and he was taken into Babylon with chains, right? But he dies on his way there and then is thrown on the side of the road like a donkey, like just a piece of meat. He's just thrown there and he just stays there. Now, if we look on verses 13 and on, it's going to talk more about Jeconiah's father, and then we get to finally Jeconiah, and then that's when we get to Jeconiah's curse. Now, in verse 13 of chapter 22 of Jeremiah, we have the words justice and righteousness again. So verses 3 to 5, Jeremiah is saying, listen, you must have, he's telling the king Zedekiah, and he's saying, the kingdom of Judah, you guys need to have this. You guys need to practice this. He's mentioning these words that, King Zedekiah, you got to promote this. You got to do this more. You got to promote this in your kingdom. So we look at verse 13, we see that Jehoiakim, who's the father of Jeconiah, was admonished for two reasons. Because he acted criminally, there was no justice, and without righteousness. Now, if you keep reading the verses, you'll see what he did. He basically hired workers to build his palace. Now, while they were still building, like the first floors, the bottom floors of the palace, right? Now, legally, he didn't owe them any money because according to the law, the workers would only get paid once they were done with the work, right? Legally. But he never paid them, right? He did not owe them any money legally, as I mentioned, right? But even though it was legal, it was a lack of righteousness that he let them continue working, right, to build his palace without payment. So even when they got to working on the upper stories, the upper floors of the palace, they still didn't get paid for the groundwork or for the ground floor or anything below the upper stories. And if you keep reading, when he finally did pay them, he didn't even pay them minimal rates. It's like basically almost free labor, slavery, almost. That's basically what happened here. He didn't really care. And as I mentioned, Jehoiakim was Jeconiah's father. And Jehoiakim, his father, was the righteous king Josiah. Josiah is famous for two things. He's famous for his famous getting rid of idolatry campaign. This king Josiah, was very famous for, he heard a prophet goes to him and says, listen, this is what's happening in your kingdom. God doesn't like it. So he hears this and he changes. He's like, okay, I need to do something. He took action and he had this campaign against idolatry. He starts to tear down all types of idolatry all over his kingdom. He was successful up to a certain point, right? But at least he took action versus other kings who didn't do anything or who promoted idolatry. And then the way that this king actually dies, while he went to war against Egypt, and he actually went to war with his soldiers. He was in the battlefield with his soldiers, which is already like, wow. Usually a lot of kings wouldn't go into battle with their soldiers. A bow and arrow gets him, and he dies, sadly. So Josiah was the father of Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim is a king for 11 years, right? During that time period, he swears allegiance to Babylon as a vassal state. Of course, he rebels. He breaks his word. Then we have the king of Babylon who sends his army with troops from Aram, Moab, Ammon to conquer Judah. They conquer Judah. They get him into chains. He dies on his way to Babylon, and he gets thrown over to the side, as I mentioned before. It was really bad. We see that he dies, and then his son takes over as a king. Now, who his son is? King Jeconiah. Now let's go to verse 16. So in verse 16, the one who oversees justice for the poverty-stricken is emulating God, and who pities the poor. It's fascinating. In the book of Proverbs, Mishle, this is also another big theme where if you take care of the poor, you give charity, you try to do what's right, it's just basic humanity good stuff, which, by the way, it's not always easy. It's not always easy. So many kings that we see in the prophets and the Nevi'im, they weren't doing this. They were promoting everything else but this. They weren't taking care of the orphan or the widow. They were not being just. They were being bribed. They brought idolatry when they know that there's only one God and they should be monotheistic. They had temples, worshiping different types of gods and goddesses. There was orgies in the temple, prostitution, and the list goes on. It gets worse. Again, not every king did this, but there were many who did. So whoever gives to the poor, oversees justice, is emulating God. You're not God, but you're emulating in the ways of God. You're being a good example. You're upgrading yourself as a person or as a king or whoever the person was, but you're also getting closer to God. And this message still applies to us today, of course. Now in verse 17, we continue to see more of this guy's issues. He commits fraud, he cheats in monetary issues, he even causes physical harm. And all of this happens, why? right? It mentions that it was because of his eyes and his heart, right? The eyes and the heart of a person, I've heard this a way back, that the eyes and the heart of a person are the spies of sin. The eyes see something, they're like, oh, I want that. The heart desires, and then our limbs just act upon what our eyes and what our heart desires or what it wants. The question is, are we going to allow, right? Because, our heart and our eyes will always desire something, will always want something. The question is, what are we doing, right, to curb that want or that desire? Because a lot of times what we want and our desires are not appropriate according to the eyes of God, right? As a Jew or as a non-Jew. So what are we doing? Are we behaving like these kings, Yehoiakim, right? Or are we behaving better, like Shlomo Hamelech or David Hamelech, David or Solomon or Josiah, as an example? Now we go to verse 18 of Jeremiah chapter 22 and mentions that his conduct was so bad that even his female relatives or his wife will not lament his death. It just continues to show how bad he was. And then famously in verse 19, as I mentioned, just as a donkey dies and the donkey is not buried, so will he not be buried, and he will die outside of Jerusalem. And that's exactly what happens to him. Now that I mentioned that, let's go from verses 20 and on. So from verses 20 and on, God complains, says that the Jewish people are not listening to him. They're not listening, and they haven't been listening to him since their youth. And they relied on other countries like Egypt or Syria and not God. But now, it doesn't really matter now at this point, because they're going to be exiled by the king of Babylon. They're going to be exiled there. Now, this is another thing that comes up, where during the prophets, there were many different times of history, of Jewish history, and biblical Jewish history, where the Jews were either very observant and, they relied on God on a lot of stuff, but then there were times where they were not observant. They weren't following the Torah of God, and they relied on material things. They relied on the temple, on the actual physical structure of the temple, or they relied on allies like Egypt or Syria. But God is saying, why are you relying on these things? You have me. I took you out of Egypt, right? I sent 10 plagues. I opened the sea for you. While you guys were in the wilderness, manna fell down. So many miracles happened. I gave you the Torah. You heard my voice. And so many of the miracles that we see throughout the Hebrew scriptures. And he's like, but you know something? It doesn't matter now, because you guys are going to go into exile anyway. By the time we get to the book of Jeremiah, and definitely Ezekiel already, the Jewish people are about to, or they're going through exile into Babylon. Right? In the book of Isaiah, they're not there yet. Isaiah's predicting things, and he's saying, listen, this is going to happen to you, but you can change if you repent and you change your ways and you follow my Torah, right? And you practice justice and righteousness, and you give to the poor, you follow my Torah, you do what's correct, all of this can go away. Because as we mentioned in other recordings, negative prophecy can be thrown away. It can be cut off. Right, like the negative prophecy of the people of Nineveh, right? They were supposed to get destroyed, but they repented and they changed their ways and their deeds, and God forgave them. This could have also happened to the Jewish people, right? But it had to happen as a whole, not just the righteous or not just a couple of individuals. It had to happen as a whole. But that's not what happened. Now, from verse 24 and on, we begin speaking about Coniah or Jeconiah. In verse 25, we see that the verse delineates that 4 catastrophes are going to happen to this king, Jeconiah. First of all, he was going to be captured by people who had no mercy on him. And it happens. He was going to be frightened that he was going to lose his ability to fight them off. His enemy was going to be the king of Babylon. And last but not least, the Chaldeans. Were going to attack him. And all of these things happen. Now, we get to the famous verse 30, Jeremiah 22:30. If we read verse 30 carefully, we're going to see a couple of punishments. Now, this is somewhere where people they read this verse too quickly. The curse of Jeconiah, right, is not just a one thing. It's a couple parts. if you read Jeremiah 22:30, it says that this king, he's going to be childless. He's going to be a man that's not going to succeed in life. And number 3 is the famous one. His descendants won't be king on the throne of David. So this curse of Jeconiah really has 3 parts. It's not just one part. It's really 3. I want to mention that. Now, we see his son Shealtiel doesn't become a king. His grandson only becomes governor, but it doesn't become a king on the throne of David. It's a big difference. Is being the president and the governor the same thing? No. They both have authority, but they're very different levels of authority, and they have different jobs, of course, but they're not the same thing. So we see that curse of Jeconiah, the part that his descendants won't be king of the throne of David, that stays. Now, I'm going to mention one thing. That there's a very specific part of Christianity that says, no, this curse of Jeconiah was lifted. It was lifted because according to the Talmud, right? According to the Talmud, which is Jewish literature, according to the Talmud, there's a story, and this is true, there is a story that mentions that once Jeconiah got exiled, they threw him into a dungeon, into the Babylon prison. He goes there. But then the king of Babylon sends his wife, so he can be, he can be intimate. He can be with his wife. But when his wife gets there, he tells her husband, Jeconiah, like, listen, I'm in nida. I'm menstruating right now, so I'm in nida. And according to the Torah, a Jewish man is not supposed to be intimate with his wife when she's in nida, when she's menstruating. It's a big sin. It's a prohibition. And in this moment, even though Jeconiah had not been intimate with his wife or with any woman for a while, he doesn't have sex with her. And he actually repents to God for a lot of the mistakes that he did in the past. And God accepts his repentance and lifts up a portion of the curse, or lifts up the curse. And which was that portion? It wasn't the portion that says that, oh, now your sons can become kings of the throne of David. No. One of the parts of the curse was that he was going to be childless. Now guess what? He was not going to be childless because then he has a son, Shealtiel. He has a son named Shealtiel. And then that son has another son, Zerubbabel, so that's his grandson, and so forth. Now, it is true, even though that portion of the curse was lifted, the other portion of that curse was not lifted. That's why whoever wrote Luke and Matthew are trying to get rid of this name Jeconiah, because they don't want Joseph or Jesus to be connected to this name Jeconiah, because this curse of Jeconiah brings a problem, right? If Joseph, because again, these two genealogies are genealogies of Joseph, Matthew's and Luke's. They're not Mary's genealogies. They're Joseph's genealogies. If Joseph comes from the line of Jeconiah, then if he's the adoptive father, or just the father in general, or the earthly father of Jesus, then that means, and Joseph adopts Jesus, then that means that Jesus cannot be the Messiah on the throne of David. That's why these two authors, whoever wrote Matthew and Luke, are trying to get rid of this name. The only portion of that curse that was lifted was that now he's not childless. And God accepts his repentance. And interesting enough, God accepted his repentance without the blood of an animal, without the blood of the Messiah, without any cross, without someone dying for him, without any of these things. Just saying. And God accepted this wicked man's repentance and got rid of that portion of the curse. So have that in mind. So when the New Testament mentions that the only way, right, for you to be good with God or you to accept salvation is to accept the death and resurrection of Jesus, right? That's not true. That's the New Testament's way of salvation. That's their theological message. But according to the Hebrew Scriptures, then and forever, the way you get close to God, the way you receive salvation is you truly doing teshuvah, repenting of your ways. And again, I'll do a video where I go into a lot more details about this, but you actually repenting and changing your ways and returning to God. That is how you do it, not by accepting the death of the Messiah. That's not even the Messiah's job to die for your sins, as I mentioned in other videos. Now, we're going to answer the last question, guys, which is, what are some Christian answers in regards to Jesus' cursed lineage? Ooh la la, that's a good question, right, Aurus? Yes. Okay, so this is what I've heard from different types of Christians, pastors, elders, the big people, this is what I've heard over and over. So first of all, one answer I've heard is that the curse of Jeconiah actually doesn't apply to Jesus. It doesn't. How so? Because Jesus was born of a virgin, it doesn't apply to him. Because his real dad is God. His dad is not Joseph. So Joseph is part of the curse of Jeconiah, not Jesus. And you know something? Technically, in theory, it does work. But there's a problem. There's actually many problems with that statement. So if that's the case, then why does Matthew provide a genealogy of Joseph and goes into so much direct and indirect references and work to show this genealogy and to show that Jesus is the Christ, that Jesus is the Messiah, right, that is connected to the lineage of Joseph? So if this genealogy is worthless, right, then why go through all this work? Then why show all this? It's pointless then. It's worthless because Joseph is unrelated to Jesus? What? It doesn't make sense, right? Also, another thing is that one of the things of the Mashiach, Ben David, the Messiah, is that his father needs to come from the line of Judah, his biological father. Also, the concept that the Messiah is going to be born from a virgin does not exist in the Hebrew Scriptures. Isaiah 7:14 does not prove that a Messiah is going to come from a virgin. I actually did a video on that, so if you're interested, check out that video where I go into detail about Isaiah 7:14 and how the Christian view of that has been distorted. And Isaiah 7 is not even about a Messiah or about a future Messiah and so forth. So that's one answer that I've heard a lot, right? That technically Jesus, that's not his father, so he's not related to it. But then we have these other problems that I mentioned. Now, so that's one answer that I've heard. Also, we have to understand there's no biblical basis for the idea that a father can pass his tribal lineage by adoption, right? So, for example, it never says it in the Torah. Never says it in the Torah, which is the first 5 books of Moses, or says it in the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures. And if that were a possibility, trust me, that would come up, especially in the book of Vayikra, of Leviticus, where it's about all the laws of the Levites and of the Kohanim, of the Cohens, and all these people. No, it doesn't come up. Or just in general, this law, it doesn't exist. So, for example, let's say a man from the tribe of Levi, let's say he was a priest in the temple, working at the temple, and he adopts a son. Of course he could adopt a son. You could adopt a son or a daughter, right? And they become your kid, right? But if you were to adopt a kid that came from another tribe, let's say, the fact that the father who's adopting this son or daughter, his tribal lineage is not going to transfer now from mine to his. It doesn't work that way. It's like if me, as a Hispanic man, which I am Hispanic if you haven't realized, right, Aurus Sanchez, even though I was born in the United States, but I'm also Hispanic and Jewish, of course. If I adopted an Asian kid, an African-American, or let's say a kid from India, let's just say I'm giving you different possibilities. Does my lineage or my heritage of being Hispanic, does that transfer on to this kid now? Are these kids going to become Hispanic now? Maybe they could learn the language. Maybe if I teach them Spanish, they can learn it, but it's not going to transfer. It doesn't work that way. Same thing. Tribal lineage by adoption does not occur. And on top of that, the tribal lineage only goes through the father. Where do we see this? Numbers chapter 1, verses 18. Famous piece of evidence. Ezra chapter 2. I think verse 59, but I know it's in Ezra chapter 2. We see this, that the tribal lineage goes through the father, right? Doesn't go through adoption. Now, the idea of adoption and that lineage or that, kingship or things go through adoption, that was a huge thing during the Greco-Roman period, especially during the Roman period, right? Where adoption, where kings were adopting sons, and this adoption thing was a huge idea, and things could be transferred by adoption. And we see this, Dr. Ehrman speaks about this, Dr. Pagel speaks about this in many books. And when was the New Testament written? It was written during towards the end of the 1st century, 2nd century, right? During the Roman period. Connection right there. Also, Joseph, as I mentioned, I think I just mentioned this, that Joseph could have never passed on his lineage by adoption because it doesn't exist, right? So Joseph can never pass on his lineage by adoption. And let's say even if this was possible, let's say this was possible, guess what? If he's the adoptive father of Jesus, then this curse of Jeconiah is going to transfer to Jesus then, right? Because we see the Jeconiah curse in Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 30. So if Joseph descended from Jeconiah and he falls under this curse, he cannot be a king. He cannot be a king on the throne of David. So can Jesus. If we're going to say that things are passing down by adoption, it doesn't work that way. No, like tribal lineage, stuff like that, it does not. It doesn't fly. Also, Christian apologists will claim that Jesus traces himself back to King David through the mother Mary, right? And again, this is with the idea when Christians are saying that, well, in Luke, Jesus, Luke is going through Mary's genealogy. So that's another way that Jesus can connect himself to King David, right? As shown in the 3rd chapter of Luke. But again, as I've mentioned, there's many problems with this. There's no evidence that Mary comes from David. As I mentioned in Luke chapter 1, it looks like she comes from the orbit of Levi. The 3rd chapter of Luke is tracing Joseph's genealogies, not Mary's. You can look at it at the end of the genealogy. It says, at the end of it, it says what? Does it say Mary? No, it says Joseph. And even if Mary can trace herself back to David, again, tribal affiliation, tribal lineage goes through the father. Ezra chapter 2, Numbers chapter 118. Now, even if the family line could go through the mother, let's say we'll grant it, right? Mary, if that's the case, then Mary doesn't come from a legitimate messianic family, because according to the Hebrew scriptures, the Messiah not only must be a descendant from King David, but also through his son Solomon. And if we look at Luke's genealogy, it's going through King David and through Nathan, right? So already, guess what? Luke's genealogy is off the table. And we see this prophecy in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 14, 1 Chronicles chapter 17, verses 11 through 14, 1 Chronicles chapter 22, verses 9 through 10. 9 and 10, and 1 Chronicles chapter 28, verses 4 and 6. It says it needs to go through King David and King Solomon. So then the 3rd chapter of Luke is useless because it's going through King David and Nathan. So let's say I'm even granting the argument that Luke is going through Mary's genealogy, or we can connect Jesus and Mary through King David. Luke, which is supposedly doing that, which is not, guess what? It's off the table. It doesn't work. No trabaja. And also, if we look at Luke chapter 3, verse 27, it lists Shealtiel and Zerubbabel in this genealogy. And guess what? These two are descendants from whom? From the cursed Jeconiah. So even if we're looking and we're going to consider Luke's genealogy, if Mary descends from them, then guess what? This is another way of showing that if Mary descended from King David, right, and Luke's genealogy is correct, then and Shealtiel and Zerubbabel are in this genealogy, who, according to Luke, comes from Neri. Neri is just a made-up name for Jeconiah. Then guess what? That Jeconiah curse is also in Luke, and Jesus cannot be the Messiah according to the curse of Jeconiah in Matthew and in Luke. So it also would disqualify her from being a messianic progenitor. So there was two ways, right? We're looking at it from this angle, that Luke's genealogy, right? And one aspect is going through Nathan, not Solomon. The Messiah must come from Solomon, the Messiah must come from David and Solomon, not just David, right? But Luke has David and Nathan. So that already disqualifies from being a messianic progenitor. And then if we look at another example, the Luke genealogy has Shealtiel and Zerubbabel, who come from who? From Jeconiah. Luke just changed the name to Neri. So that's another way of saying, oh, the curse of Jeconiah is also here. And Mary, even if she descended from them, it would also disqualify her, which would also disqualify Jesus if we're trying to connect Jesus and Mary to King David. But it doesn't work that way for so many reasons. And the Matthew's genealogy, as we've unraveled it, has the curse of Jeconiah, has mistakes. Whoever wrote Matthew omitted different names to fit his own theological agenda, which goes against the Torah prohibition. So many things, guys. So many problems. But again, you would only know this from not only reading, but investigating the Bible, as we've done here, guys. Guys, if you've liked this episode, please like this video, share it, comment down below, like, subscribe. I would really appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate you guys being here. And if any questions, you guys know where to reach me. Thank you guys so much. And of course, till next time.